If he starts talking about tariffs in pre-1913 terms, in other words, if he thinks, I'm going to get all this money coming into the United States from these countries, they're going to have to give us this money, that's not going to work. No country will want to make a deal when they think that we're doing tariffs not in pursuit of fairness.
Should resign. If he asked you to leave, would you go?
No.
This morning, President Trump now says he has no intention of firing Jerome Powell, the Fed chair he appointed.
The media called it reckless. The left called it a failure. But what if the so-called trade war wasn't a war at all? What if it was a calculated move, one of the boldest plays in modern economic history?
I have no intention of firing him. I would like to see him be a little more active in terms of his idea to lower interest rates.
Is Donald Trump caving or just closing the deal?
Stock market recently has recovered somewhat. We're about where it was in August. I didn't think it was too bad in August of 2024. It's recovering 1 to 2% on occasion. And why is that? Because Donald Trump has announced that J.D. Vance and his wife, who is of Indian legacy, her family was born in India, and J.D. Vance met with the Indian government officials, and there may be a trade deal.
In the United States, we're proud of the deep connection between our nations, between India and the United States. Prime Minister Modi, as most of you probably know, was one of the first visitors welcomed into the Oval Office during President Trump's second term.
The strong relationship between India and the US heralds a new era in global superpowers, particularly as tensions with China reach an all-time high.
Japan has been talking with us. They both want, us and Japan want a deal. And more importantly, Donald Trump said he's willing to lower tariffs on China.
My relationship with President Xi is great.
So you've talked?
It's been great for a long time. We've had a very good relationship, and I think we'll make a deal with China.
The left says, oh, he's caving. This was all unnecessary. Interpret it that way, but it's more likely art of the deal. In other words, we're going to invade Panama, but we're not going to invade Panama. We just want Panama to let American companies run the exit and the entry to the canal, and that's probably going to happen.
They violated the agreement. China's running the Panama Canal. That was not given to China. That was given to Panama foolishly.
Canada's going to be the 51st state. No, it's not going to be the first state, but Canada should defend themselves and pay 2% of their GDP, and they need to address a $65 to $100 billion deficit.
I think Canada would be much better off being a 51st state because we lose $200 billion a year with Canada, and I'm not going to let that happen. It's too much. Why are we paying $200 billion a year, essentially in subsidy to Canada? Now, if they're a 51st state, I don't mind doing it.
But we want to absorb Greenland. No, we don't. We want Denmark, the colonial power, with this huge North American colony. We want them to help them a little bit.
So there was a conference call between President Trump and the Danish Prime Minister. It apparently didn't go very well.
And indeed, they're starting to put Greenland on their imperial flags, and they gave them $1 billion, and the base is secure. And they're probably the Greenland people, 50,000 or so, will want U.S. security. So that is the art of the deal.
I wasn't privy to that phone call, but I imagine the phone call went the way a lot of these phone calls go, and that is, he just speaks bluntly and frankly with people. And ultimately, I think diplomacy in many cases works better when you're straightforward as opposed to using platitudes and language that translates to nothing.
To get China to come and reduce its $300 billion trade surplus with the United States, Donald Trump talked about these huge tariffs. Now he will talk down, and we'll probably get a deal. In art of the deal fashion, we saw that with NATO. He harangued them in 2018. They were furious, said he might not come to their aid. They haven't met their 2% 2014 promises. And guess what? They started to spend more in defense, timely so, because when the Ukraine war broke out, Europe had spent $100 billion more on defense expenditure. And more importantly, they had Finland and Sweden, two of the most muscular of all the European nations in terms of munitions and defense readiness, now both part of NATO. That worked. And I think the same thing is happening with trade.
So what changed? Would China even be at the table without the pressure of tariffs? Would India, Japan, South Korea even talk trade if we hadn't flipped the script? Victor Davis Hanson calls it the art of the deal. Start big, threaten high, then walk it back and close the deal. So we ask again, was it bluff or was it leverage? What about Europe? Are they staying out of talks because it's in their best interest or because they don't want Trump to win? Do they prefer aligning with the American left over making real economic gains? And here's the kicker. Nations that come to the table first are getting better deals. Will Europe be left behind?
Here's the dynamic. The Europeans detest Donald Trump more than they see their self-interest. In other words, they would rather be on the outside of these trade negotiations and punish Donald Trump than they would be with the Asian powers and make a deal and profit mutually with the United States. And partly that's because they're akin to the American left. The EU people want to help the American left, and one of the ways they think they can is to stonewall and watch the bond and stock market go down, and then they could come in later with more favorable concessions from the United States. The problem with that thinking is that if India cuts a deal and South Korea cuts a deal, and now they're talking about Japan, Taiwan, Australia, the Trump administration has already established openly, transparently, that those countries that are first to cut a deal will get the most favorable terms. And so the more people that come in and have a reciprocal agreement with the United States, I'm not saying it's going to be parity, but if we cut this trillion-dollar deficit by half, that will be a considerable achievement. The Europeans then will see that they're left out, and especially if we come to an accord in the next month or so with China, not that we're going to be able to force China to have no tariffs on their part, but we might be able to lower them and then make them buy American products to reduce that $300 billion. If that were to be true, then Europe has missed the boat. The bottom line, the trade war or tariff war was never really a war. It was just an effort to stop a 50-year cycle of chronic American trade deficits that had harmed the industrial interior. As long as Donald Trump talks about parity, the desirability of lowering our trade deficits and the unfairness of our trade partners and an idealized goal of no tariffs, he's got a winning issue. However, if he starts talking about tariffs in pre-1913 terms, before the income tax, when tariffs were the primary source of American revenue, in other words, if he thinks, I'm going to get all this money coming into the United States from these countries that are going to have to give us this money, and then I can cut taxes on tips, I can do this, that's not going to work. No country will want to make a deal when they think that we're doing tariffs not in pursuit of fairness, but in pursuit of gouging them, whether true or not. So as long as he talks about any other aspect of tariffs except revenue raising, that is a losing political issue.
Was this ever truly about trade? Did we push too hard, or just hard enough to be taken seriously again? Are these new trade deals shaping a stronger global order, or are they isolating old allies in the name of short-term wins? One thing is clear, the so-called tariff war was never about chaos. It was about confrontation and course correction. And in that space between panic and purpose, the world is watching how America redefines its economic power.